Good morning. This is Trudy Rubin, author of the Worldview column for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And today I'm going to be speaking about my just completed trip to Israel and the West Bank. The format is going to be a little different than usual. I am going to talk to you about the trip, drawing on some of the many questions that I've already received, give you a little bit of background. And then I'm going to take your questions and refer to some of the long lists that have already been sent to me online. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you can submit your questions to me. To do so, please ask them in the comments section at the bottom of this page. And if you're watching on social media, please visit inquirer.com/live to submit questions. Thanks, and let's get started. I've been traveling to Israel ever since I got out of college. And I lived there for 6 years as a Middle East correspondent before I came to the Inquirer for the Christian Science Monitor, covering Israel and the Arab world. I've been making trips almost every year since. This year is the first time I've traveled to Israel since before COVID. And it is an Israel that is very different from what I have come to know over the decades. The issues that are roiling the country are not new. There has always been tension between religious and secular Israelis, those who wish to annex the West Bank and those who don't, ultra-nationalists, mostly on the West Bank, and those who really want to forget about the Palestinian issue. All those strands have always been there and caused tensions. But what has happened now has brought them all to a head. I'm speaking about the so-called judicial reforms that Prime Minister Netanyahu has proposed en masse that would undermine the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court and basically change the structure of Israel's democratic government. With his attacks on the courts, Netanyahu has elevated this ongoing debate to center stage, whether or not Israel will remain as the liberal democratic country envisioned by the founders, or whether it will become something else, Israel's version of the religious and ultra-nationalist populism that is infecting other democracies, including ours. So let me talk a little bit first about the atmosphere that I found when I first came to Israel. I was there for nearly 3 weeks. Even though the demonstrations, the pro-democracy demonstrations in which the participants screamed "Demokratia" over and over, even though in Tel Aviv, where the biggest are, they have somewhat of the atmosphere of a carnival. What fascinated me was when I talked to individual Israelis at demonstrations in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, opposition demonstrations, there was real fear underneath. And why that fear? Why did I hear it expressed so powerfully? A pregnant woman who was there with her 3-year-old in Tel Aviv on a Saturday night said, "I'm afraid for her future." A high-tech businessman said to me, "If this is the way things are going to go, I may have to consider moving my business elsewhere." Military reservists who I spoke to there said, "We are willing to die for an Israeli democracy, but not for an autocracy imposed from above." So why have these supposed judicial reforms, which the opposition calls a judicial coup, so frightened large segments of the public? First, let me just talk a bit about what these reforms comprise, or this judicial coup comprises. And then I'm going to talk about the fears that lie behind what Netanyahu has put forward. What is being suggested are changes to the nature of the Supreme Court in Israel. Israel's system is very different from ours. Do not accept statements that you might read that say, well, the US has political appointment of Supreme Court justices, so it's not different in what Netanyahu is proposing. It's very different. In Israel, there is no constitution, just so-called basic laws that don't have the full flavor and import and heft of a constitution. There is only one house of parliament, the Knesset. The party or coalition of parties that get the biggest number of seats control the Knesset. And what Netanyahu wants to do is diminish drastically the power of the Supreme Court, which is the only check and balance on a governing party that controls the Knesset. He wants to, these laws would basically eliminate the oversight capacity. They would put appointment of judges in the hands of the ruling coalition. They would enable the passage of laws diminishing human rights for minorities, women, potentially gays, certainly Arab citizens of Israel. And they would make it possible to vastly expand settlements and approach annexation of the West Bank with no check by the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court has let a lot of pseudo-annexation go on in the West Bank, but this would finalize any potential limitation on the taking of Palestinian land, the dismantlement of so-called illegal settlements on Palestinian land, and the changing of the whole Israeli manner of ruling over Palestinians, which, and I will get into this later and more with questions if you're interested, which is, if not already there, clearly verging on a system that can only be called apartheid. So why has this judicial overhaul been thrust on the Israeli public when the current governing coalition ran, and it comprises several parties, the participants, the different parties, and certainly Netanyahu did not speak about this potential judicial overhaul. It was sprung on voters after the coalition had been formed. Many in the opposition argue, and there seems to be plenty of evidence to support this, that it was put forward now by Netanyahu in order to thwart his possible conviction in ongoing trials for corruption. There is one trial comprising 3 cases, and it is about to restart sessions later this month. And the reason that they argue this is because there are laws that have already been put forward that the Supreme Court clearly would have vetoed as bearing on the basic laws and contravening them, that have passed already. And if the Supreme Court is weakened, it cannot rule negatively on these laws. For example, a law to keep Netanyahu from being dismissed from office for certain kinds of behavior, and a law that would enable Aryeh Deri, the head of the closely allied Shas party with Netanyahu, to override the Supreme Court's decision that since he was convicted of corruption, he should not be given a minister's post. These are the kind of laws that are already being pushed through. But more than that, what's envisioned is that the potential laws that could be put forward by this governing coalition with only a 4-seat majority could violate the restrictions on potential religious laws being put forward that would diminish women's rights, secular rights, and they could also enable laws that sharply diminish Arab citizens of Israel's ability to vote, and so on. I can talk more about this in the question period. So when you talk to demonstrators in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, what they tell you is, first of all, they are afraid of a supremacy being requested, being demanded by religious parties who only believe in halachic law, and they are very afraid of radical coalition partners of Netanyahu, led by two figures who would never have been imagined in government not long ago. They are afraid that these parties, led by Mr. Smotrich, who is now finance minister, and Mr. Ben-Gvir, who is national security minister, will take Israel in a nationalist, populist, Jewish supremacy direction that has never taken hold of the country before. I can talk also more about those parties in question period. Now, this nationalist religious trend is being seen globally, including here. For example, in Hungary and Poland, the court systems have been dramatically weakened. Netanyahu, as well as President Trump, often praises Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, who has succeeded in silencing the court system and controlling it, muzzling the media, and basically establishing a one-party state. In Poland, the court systems has also been put under control of the ruling party. And so when you go to demonstrations, I was at one last Saturday in Tel Aviv, you hear the chant, "We are not Poland. We are not Hungary." In other words, the opposition demonstrators do not wish to join the list of countries that are moving towards illiberal democracy, and you could include ours in that grouping. What is also fascinating about what's going on in Israel is the role of the military. I've talked to many military reservists in elite units who are now saying they will not report for reserve duty if these undemocratic challenges to the court are passed into law. Why would soldiers refuse? Well, first of all, because reserve duty in the elite units in Israel is largely voluntary, and the most elite units, pilots, and intelligence units, cyber units, and special forces are very much controlled by an ethos that has come down since the founding fathers of Israel, an ethos that demands that they follow the democratic rules of a democratic country. And what these pilots, I've talked to pilot reservists, say is, we're willing to die for the country, as I mentioned before, but not for an autocratic regime that wants to control all levers of power. They are also aware that this coalition government, as it now stands, in which members of Knesset Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have immense powers, much greater than their 14 seats together would seem to authorize. They're afraid that these radical members of parliament, Ben-Gvir was convicted of terrorism. The army refused to take him into regular military service because of his support for Mayor Kahane, branded a terrorist in the United States and in Israel for his wish to deport or kill all Arabs. They are afraid that these two men and the movements that they are encouraging to violence in the West Bank, they're thrust towards expelling Arabs or openly condemning them to live as second-class or third-class citizens, even Palestinian citizens of Israel. There is the fear that they will spark a third intifada on the West Bank. These ministers, especially with the unusual powers they have been granted by Netanyahu, Smotrich has basically been given control of the civil administration in the West Bank, which formerly had been controlled by the army. He has been given control of a settlement expansion. He's also finance minister, so he can funnel money to roads expansion on the West Bank. Ben-Gvir has encouraged settler violence on the West Bank, and settlers, radical settlers, are running amok, so to speak, at a greater degree than ever before, sort of assuming the right to go in and attack Palestinian towns, as famously was done in the town of Huwara, which I visited, setting fires and so forth. They call them revenge attacks for terrorism on the West Bank, but this is a vicious circle, and the law enforcement bodies of Israel should be maintaining control over force. Instead, the settlers are taking it up themselves. And that is why you see this unhappiness in elite units who serve voluntarily, especially pilots. Half the pilots in the Israeli Air Force are reservists who do an immense amount of time each year on a volunteer basis, coming back year after year and providing the backbone of the Israeli Air Force. So you're seeing a situation where backbone communities of Israel, the tech community, backbone units, elite units of the military, economic entrepreneurs, academia, think tanks, and knowledgeable people across the social scene of Israel are simply waking up to the threat that their children may not have the democracy that they took for granted. There are class issues here, but this is not simply rich white Israelis against those of Middle East background who came from Arab countries. It is not simply rich versus poor. There are some elements of that. I can also get into that with questions. But this is a broader movement that is attempting to spread its strength beyond the upper and middle classes and beyond the left center to the right center of those who are unhappy with the way Netanyahu is acting. I'll just mention one more thing, and then I'm going to get to your specific questions. The Palestinian issue is absent from these demonstrations, and that is deliberate on the part of the organizers. I heard it from top organizers who coordinate the 150 to 200 different groups who have amalgamated into a force that comes together not only in Tel Aviv, but cities and towns across the country. The reason they say they are not bringing up the concerns of West Bank Palestinians or Palestinian citizens of Israel, who comprise 20% of the population, the reason is that they want to expand the base of those who oppose the judicial coup. They want to bring in disaffected members of Netanyahu's own Likud party who are unhappy about being in coalition with what they call radical crazies. That means the religious, populist, nationalist, Jewish supremacy, settler-based parties, and unhappy about the demands of the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition who want their men to be permanently excused from military service. So there is unhappiness on the center right. And in order to pull in more of a base, the organizers do not talk about the Palestinian issue, and you see very few Israelis in the demonstrations raising signs saying no democracy when we have occupation. This is a critical issue which will be which the opposition in Israel will have to face sooner rather than later, because these radical settler parties are determined to extend virtual occupation, which I'll talk about more in questions, and it is going on as we speak. It has gone on for decades, and it's reached the critical point where it is almost impossible to envision a separate Palestinian state side by side with Israel. If Israel keeps control of the West Bank, 2 million people, another 350,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and frankly, Israel still controls Gaza, another over 2 million people, you will have a situation where Israel will be controlling permanently a population of Palestinians that outnumbers Jews. We are almost there already. And on the West Bank, the march of expanding infrastructure connecting the West Bank with Israel is so intense, as I saw when I drove all around the West Bank, that separating the West Bank, Gaza from Israel becomes almost impossible. And yet, a one-state solution, I believe, is simply a pipe dream. I think that is a formula for continued civil war. So, and frankly, so do most West Bankers think. They are rather lost at the minute because they don't see one state, they don't see two states, and no one really can envision on the West Bank what the future will be, except they say, we are staying put. This is what I heard. The new resistance is, we're not leaving, we're staying here. So let me just sum up by telling you some remarks that were made to me by a former head of the Shin Bet, Ami Ayalon, when I talked to him at length about where is Israel headed. He said, if anyone tells you they know how this is all going to end, they're lying, because none of us know. In other words, no one is sure whether Netanyahu is going to try to ram this judicial coup through now that the Knesset is back from Passover vacation. Nobody is sure whether he will try to drag it out because he doesn't want to make that decision, in which case the radical and religious parties, especially the radical settler parties, might quit the coalition and the government fall. and no one is certain whether he might try to make a deal with the court. So on the Israeli side, everything is simply up for grabs, and no one is certain whether the demonstrations will continue indefinitely. And on the Palestinian side, no one is certain about their future, and I will talk more about that in questions. So I'm going to stop now and just turn to some of the issues that were raised by people who signed up to listen to this program. Let me start with a question on the West Bank, since so many of you have asked similar questions. Compare the Israel court system to the US and the issues they both face. The major difference is that the court system in the US, the Supreme Court, is outlined by the founding fathers in the Constitution. So there are certain things that cannot change. In Israel, since there's no constitution, the Netanyahu coalition is trying to make permanent changes in how the judges are selected and what powers they have that will basically put the court under the control of whoever is in the ruling coalition. In the United States, when a president picks the potential Supreme Court judges, there are hearings, there is a confirmation process, and in order to end the debate on the nominee, you need a 3/5 vote for cloture and then a majority vote. In Israel, there is one house of parliament. The president is ceremonial. So if the ruling party and coalition can pick the justices, it can then automatically confirm them and control the situation. It can eliminate their powers and pass new basic laws that would permanently, supposedly, enshrine those limited powers, and then prevent the court, which it's trying to do, from having any ability to overrule those new basic laws. So what the Netanyahu government is trying to do is to eliminate the court as a check on what a ruling coalition can do, which will then enable laws that could enshrine some religious laws that frighten the secular population and could effectively annex the West Bank with no opposition and could destroy rights of women, gays, Arab citizens to vote, and on and on. The checks and balances would totally disappear. So the two systems are very different. And although the supporters of these reforms claim to be doing no differently than what's happening in the United States. Let me see, I have a lot of questions here. I have a question on what is the status of the trials against Netanyahu. The court will resume the hearing, but this trial, which comprises 3 separate cases mushed together, is likely to go on for years because the prosecution is calling 300 witnesses. So heaven knows how long this will go on, because after that comes the defense. And so Netanyahu is not in imminent danger of being convicted, although there is a lot of evidence against him, and the charges basically revolve around money for favors, having taken lots of gifts from a Hollywood producer, and having attempted to make deals with Israeli newspapers that they would give him favorable coverage in return for favors. So Netanyahu right now is not in imminent danger of going to jail, but he wants to control the Supreme Court, because if he is eventually convicted, the appeals would go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and ideally it would be a court packed with judges that he, his party, and his coalition had selected. Now, let's see. How can one respond to accusations of apartheid and fascism in Israel? I think this is a very critical question. And let me talk a little bit about what one sees going on between Palestinians on the West Bank and Israel, or not going on, and what one sees going on between Israel and its Arab citizens. Let me start with the Arab citizens, and then I'll move on to the issue of apartheid, because I think both parts of this are very important. Arab citizens comprise 20% of the Israeli population, and they are critical if the opposition is going to be able to form a governing coalition if for some reason the Netanyahu government would fall. Now, there have been clear indications from parties in Netanyahu's coalition that they want to suppress the vote of Arab citizens. There are many vehicles available. You're familiar with voter suppression of minorities in this country. And it's not so dissimilar, although the routes to the same end are different. So there's no question that there's a desire to suppress the vote in order to prevent an opposition coalition from being able to win more seats than Netanyahu's coalition, even though polls now show that because of what's going on in Israel, the support for Netanyahu's coalition has dropped dramatically. But there is no election plan. So even though he has only a 4-seat majority, which is 64 seats in the Knesset, and the polls show that that coalition would only get about 52 seats now, without immediate elections, he can still hold on to power. But the relationship with Palestinian citizens of Israel is fraught. When I interviewed a very interesting, moderate, and thoughtful Arab journalist in Israel, Arab meaning Palestinian, Oded Bisharat, and I interviewed Palestinian members of Knesset, they all said the same thing. We are not coming out to these demonstrations because we do not feel welcome there. One Arab party did enter into a coalition with the previous Israeli government before this new Netanyahu-led government, which took over after elections late last year. That Arab party, headed by a member of parliament named Mansour Abbas, was promised a substantial amount of funding for Arab villages, which are underfunded, are not permitted to expand territorially, and face very serious internal crime problems. That money was not forthcoming. And so Arab members of Knesset I spoke to feel that the Israelis make promises, even the so-called liberal Israelis, to help the Arab sector and don't deliver. And that Mansour Abbas made a huge mistake, and that in demonstrations with a sea of Israeli flags, they feel unwelcome because of legislation that was passed a few years ago that basically makes clear that Jews are the favored citizens of the Israeli state. Now, the liberals promise equal rights to Arab citizens, but the Arab citizens feel that hasn't been delivered. And the religious nationalists make clear that they see those Arabs as not equal and second-class citizens, and have no intention of trying to ensure that they retain equal rights under law. So that's the Palestinian citizens inside Israel. But when it comes to the West Bank, the apartheid label, is that justified? I think this is an extremely important question for Americans to grasp, because what is happening on the West Bank now is that Israel is building a system of roads which link the West Bank settlements, Jewish settlements, there's several 100,000 residents, directly to Israel proper, roads, most of which Palestinians can't travel on or can only travel on certain portions of. So there is a road network being built to directly connect those settlements, making them into suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. That network has been long in the building, but it is on steroids now. And when I drove around the West Bank, it is hard to comprehend the amount of construction whose main aim is to encircle West Bank towns, villages, and cities, so they are cut off from each other in cantons, and the roads connect the territory directly with areas where settlers drive in to work. These two radical parties that I talked about, of Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir, religious Zionism and Jewish power, are open in their contention that the West Bank belongs to Israel, and some of their members want to go back into Gaza, even though Gaza is basically controlled from the outside, the air and the sea, by Israel. And so you have cantons who do not have sovereign rights, cannot vote in Israeli elections. And these two parties say, well, they can accept second-class citizenship, they can leave, and we'll give them some subsidies, leave the country, or eventually they can be encouraged to leave, whatever that means, and you might imagine. And in the meantime, Mr. Ben-Gvir is being granted a private militia. It hasn't come into power yet. And he is suggesting that Israeli citizens could be subject to preventive detention, which basically means arrest without trial, and makes clear that he's looking to apply that to Arab citizens of Israel. And on the West Bank, Mr. Smotrich has basically taken control of governance over the settlements, which changes the whole system there, and basically means that even if they're not officially annexed, the settlements are under Israeli law and the Palestinians are under military law. And so you have an apartheid system of cantons separated by roads under a different system of law and not able to enter Israel without permit. I have another question here about whether I think then a one-state solution is possible. So let me turn to that, since I'm talking about the Palestinian question. And before I get to that, let me remind you that you can submit questions at inquirer.com/live. I have a lot of questions here, but I will encourage you to send more, because actually I'm going to try to talk faster and get more of the questions in. Just returning to the one-state, two-state question, polls on the West Bank show that West Bankers no longer believe in a two-state solution and think the game is up, that it's impossible. But they also doubt that a one-state solution is possible. And I will offer my opinion on that. One state, it doesn't address the deep communal differences between Palestinians and Israelis. This is not even about whether you'd have military conflict, but it's about the fact that neither side trusts the other, neither side believes that it can live side by side, and both sides want to be supreme in any one state. This is not a formula for a future. And in fact, I had other retired senior Israeli military folks who have fought for two states for years tell me that although two states seems extremely dubious now, one state is simply a formula for continuing unequal rule over the Palestinians in the one state, as there is unequal rule over Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it ensures guaranteed civil war. On the other hand, I have a lot of questions asking me about the future, so I'll just wrap up the Palestinian side, and then I'll get back to the Israeli side. On the other hand, if you don't deal with the question of the Palestinian population, you do wind up with an apartheid state. So you have this extremely difficult conundrum of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And what happens if you don't? The Palestinians themselves are in disarray. They have a president who has been in power for, I may have the number wrong, but it was 15 years in 2021, so it's now 17 years. They have a parliament which hasn't been re-elected for virtually the same amount of time. Palestinians on the West Bank want a legitimate government. That can only happen with elections, but the president, Mahmoud Abbas, the Israelis, and the Americans, none of them really want elections. The Israelis definitely not, Abbas definitely not, because there's a fear that Hamas could win in the West Bank, not because West Bankers love Hamas, but because they're so fed up with the corruption of the present government. So the situation is murky. All that one can say is if Israel winds up ruling over Palestinians who make up more than half of the population from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, then inevitably it's going to be an apartheid system because the Palestinian population will not have equal rights and will be confined in cantons in the West Bank and in Gaza. What is the solution? I don't know. I feel personally that Israel has had and still has a major opportunity to work harder for equal rights for its own Palestinian citizens, to move on that front as a symbol of hope for the future. Whether a government that succeeded Netanyahu and excluded the ultra-religious and the ultra-nationalists would move in that direction remains to be seen, because it didn't happen with the centrist government that came before this Bibi government, Netanyahu government, and it's unclear whether these demonstrations will jolt Israelis into recognizing that you can't have a democracy when you have half the people under your rule. If the West Bank is annexed, East Jerusalem is annexed, and Gaza is controlled, if half the people under your rule have vastly different rights than the other half. I wish I had a solution. I have been an advocate of two states for my entire reporting career, but we seem on the brink of the end of that hope, although most of the retired Israeli military I spoke to still retain that hope. Now, I have a question. Given Netanyahu's mere 4-seat majority in the current polling, what action event could prompt the scheduling of an election? That's really a good question. I think critical will be whether the demonstrations continue. When you realize that this has gone on for 17 weeks, it's truly stunning. And the question is, if the judicial upheaval drags out because Netanyahu has postponed introducing those laws to undermine the Supreme Court, he's postponed under pressure of these demonstrations. So if he keeps postponing, will the radical parties stay with him, or will they bolt, which would bring the government down and bring in a new election and a new government? Nobody is sure at how long he can delay. The radical nationalist settler parties, who had 14 seats, but the latest polls show that they would be diminished. Let me just check again. There were 14. Sorry, I lost my figures here, but they would go down by several. I think they went down to 11. And Netanyahu's party went down dramatically. And the party of former, wait a minute, if you will bear with me, I just am looking for the newest polling figures, which unfortunately seem to have eluded me. But as I said, the coalition would have gone down to 52 from 64, and most of that loss would be in Netanyahu's Likud party, and they are switching to the centrist party of former General Benny Gantz. So everything depends on whether the religious and the settler nationalist parties decide they want to keep their chairs, even if Netanyahu delays what he has promised them in judicial reform, which enables them to move further with achieving their demands in the coalition agreement. The religious parties are worth watching, because what they have demanded is that the deferments they now enjoy for their men from serving in the military be cemented and not be able to be ended. They want legislation that says you never have to serve forever. Now, the Supreme Court had ruled against that, and that's why they want to get rid of the Supreme Court. And the problem is that they have very large families, a growth rate of 4%. And so liberal Israelis look on with fear at the demographics. By the end of the decade, the ultra-Orthodox will have 16%. And at a 4% growth rate, there is a fear that down the line, a smaller and smaller proportion of Israelis will be serving in the military, while the taxes collected from the ultra-Orthodox are minuscule because their men don't work. And they want to cement huge welfare benefits that they get for those men. So this is a real sore point, and the Supreme Court has ruled that it is unequal for men in the religious community not to serve. So whether those religious parties will hang on, they want legislation passed very soon that cements their rights. And Bibi is also delaying that legislation. So there is a potential crack. And on the part of the religious nationalist parties, They want massive settlement expansion, given the green light, and massive funding in the next budget to both pay for settlements, roads, infrastructure. And if that doesn't happen, will they bolt, or do they want to hang on and hold? So this leaves things up in the air. And what everyone is looking at, just like people here look at the GOP and ask, are there 10 good men or 5 good men and women who might bolt and vote with the liberals? This is the question being asked of Netanyahu's Likud members. Will 4 or 5 Knesset members who are unhappy with this coalition bolt? But that could bring down the government. And maybe they would move over to Benny Gantz's centrist party, and he would win and become prime minister. But then, this is internal baseball. Could the opposition form a coalition without the Arabs? And you get back to that question. However, I think that the best chance for Netanyahu's government falling is if members of the Likud bolt. And so far, as we have seen with the GOP, people hang around because they're afraid if they bolt and move to another party or leave their party home, they won't get back to power. Now, let me just take a look here. Do you feel Netanyahu has lost direction and perspective? I think Netanyahu did not expect the opposition that arose inside Israel. He did not campaign on a pledge to change the court. And in the past, he never would have had anything to do with these radical Jewish parties. He didn't need them. But in this election, the moderates, he had previously been in a coalition with a centrist party, and he'd betrayed the leader, former General Benny Gantz, retired. And the centrists outside of his Likud party would not align with him. So he turned to the radicals and the religious. He would probably be happier with the previous status quo, but he is stuck with this government because otherwise he will lose power. He will not control the Supreme Court, and he might go to jail. So yes, it seems that he has lost direction and perspective. But the question still is, as somebody else asks, will the demonstrations and pushback stop the changes to the Israeli Supreme Court? In other words, again, can he postpone? But ultimately, he may have to cough up to the demands of his coalition. Now, one of the question marks over the future is this. Many of the reserve pilots, and I've interviewed some, have said they will still report to reserve duty until the moment when this judicial anti-checks and balances legislation passes. If it passes, and if these pilot reservists keep their promise, this is a red line, and they will withdraw. This is a critical security question for Israel. This is why the defense minister at one point went to Netanyahu and said, you can't go on like this because of the security issues. And Netanyahu fired him. And that's when the biggest demonstrations erupted, and then had to unfire him. So this is another crossroads that we have to see where it goes. Let me just check on. Demographically speaking, Orthodox families tend to have many more offspring. Does that reality expose Israel's vulnerability in having a true democracy and healthy push and pull between right and left? Is Israel doomed by its population? I touched on that somewhere, but I mean, in previous remarks. But I do think it is a critical question underlying Israel's future. And this is another reason why the demonstrators are so anxious to secure the role of the Supreme Court so that it guarantees equality between citizens. It is simply untenable economically for a larger and larger population of ultra-religious to continue on the dole without serving in the military and gaining larger and larger amounts of welfare. That is what the court recognized. And I think that's why the court question, one of the reasons why it's so critical now, in order to prevent this demographics on the religious side from undermining both Israeli security and the Israeli economy. Now, is it fear that drives the Israeli public in voting for the Conservative Party? And what are the goals of the counter demonstrators who support the current governing coalition? That's a very interesting question, because just like the fears and insecurities that drive the backers of Donald Trump, often having nothing to do with what they get from a Trump dominated political system when he was president. Yes, Netanyahu does play on fear. He called the reservists in the military, or some of his allies called them traitors, resistors, when in reality they are fighting for the democratic principles that are contained in the Israeli Declaration of Independence: rights for minorities, equal rights for all, equal contribution from all. These rights that belong to a left-leaning founding group of founding fathers are being threatened by ultra-religious who don't believe in secular law and by ultra-nationalists who are indifferent to democracy. And he plays, however, on fear, telling his public and the religious parties and the nationalist parties that it is the protesters who are threatening democracy. And there is a mantra that you hear from the protesters that is pushed by Netanyahu and his allies that is similar to what you hear from President Trump and GOP leaders. And their mantra goes as follows: if we won the election, and of course Trump didn't win the election, but if we won the election, then we should be able to do what we want. There should be no checks. And that is the mantra that Netanyahu sells. So I heard it repeatedly when I went a week ago, Thursday, so 8 days ago, to the pro-government demonstration in Israel. We won, so why can't we do what we want? With no understanding that in a liberal democratic system, there has to be protection for minorities. And ideally, there should be checks and balances to prevent one-party rule. This is a battle that is being fought by liberal Democrats against would-be autocrats in Hungary and Poland and in the United States. But the supporters of Netanyahu's government believe in it. They believe they are being cheated. And he also plays on the old divisions between Jews from Western countries who emigrated from Europe, from the United States, and Jews who emigrated from Arab countries. In reality, Jews who emigrated from Arab countries are doing much better now. They're in the mainstream. When I talk to pilots and navigators who are protesting, many of them come from Arab, Jewish Arab backgrounds. Their families came from Iraq or Morocco. But this division is played on So in other words, the Netanyahu government plays on fears just as the Trump government does. And often those fears are misplaced and they show a poor understanding of what a democratic government needs in the way of institutions that protect rights and prevent against a one-party state. I'm running out of time here. I haven't touched on Iran or why did Kevin McCarthy need to visit Israel to prove his bona fides, not so much to American Jews, but to evangelicals. One of Netanyahu's closest advisors has said publicly that evangelicals in the US are much more important than American Jews. I think I'm going to have to end it here, but let me just sum up by saying I think it's important for American Democrats with a small d to watch what is going on in Israel, because it is part of the overall global struggle between liberal Democrats, by which I mean Democrats who hold values similar to our founding fathers in the US, believing in checks and balances, believing in protection of minority rights. I think that this struggle in Israel speaks to the larger issues, but it also speaks to the importance of the democratic system in Israel that has always been the basis of America's alliance with Israel. And it speaks to the threats, the future threats of a failure to find a solution to the Israel-Palestine issue, because Israel ruling over a Palestinian population that surpasses the Jewish population does inevitably lead to an apartheid system. However one looks at the Palestinians, love them, hate them, those are irrelevant approaches. There are facts on the ground, and this is why so many retired Israeli senior military wanted two states, because Israel, if it winds up in endless occupation, cannot be a democratic state. So when you're looking at what to pay attention to in the future, it's whether the Netanyahu government will hold, whether the demonstrations and oppositions will continue, whether military reservists will be driven to stand down, and whether there is a way that the polls and the economic problems caused by Netanyahu's current approach and current coalition will force him to somehow look to dilute the attack on the courts. And finally, whether ultimately this fight for democracy, which has roused a lot of apathetic citizens to recognition of what democracy means, whether this will ultimately expand if the court situation is resolved democratically, whether this push for democracy will ultimately expand to include a new vision for how to deal with the problems of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I will leave it there, but I think that the ongoing struggle for democracy in Israel is definitely one of significance to the United States. Thank you very much.